Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Thursday. Welcome to the panel on financial literacy and financial well-being with a global focus on college students. My name is Abul Jalalvand. I'm a professor of finance and also executive director of the Loyola Leadership Business Hub. We're glad to have you. This is a very interesting subject. There's a lot of interest. The financial literacy is a signature program for the Loyola Business Leadership Hub, and we are looking at it from various angles. We're trying to develop actually a program to measure financial literacy in our colleges, and also our executive education is running programs in that area. And at some point, I think we would like to come up with some intervention methodologies to enhance financial literacy. So in terms of what we are going to basically do and see is that this program is going to be recorded, and our presenters will have their slides shared. We will provide those slides for you. If you're interested, we will send it to you for your own use and also for your classroom. In order to communicate your questions, that we really encourage you to do so. There is a Q&A box for these webinars. So you just basically jot down your questions there, and myself and all the participants are going to be seeing it. And then we pick and choose on those questions and we try to discuss them. Roughly around 45 minutes would be for the three presentations, and the balance would be for Q&A. So let me begin by just giving you a bit of a background. President Biden proclaimed April 21 as a National Financial Flexibility Month, emphasizing the benefit of financial capability, the value of financial literacy education, and the importance of access to financial resources tailored to individuals' strengths and circumstances. Our college students today are really facing a lot of challenges in terms of their financial decisions, balancing enrollment, employment, and everyday life expenses, especially in the context of several recessionary period that we have experienced, particularly what's going on right now. That has impacted their families and their ability basically to pursue their education, and also almost about $1.6 trillion of debt that they're stuck with. And for some, it is not clear exactly when they're going to be able to address it. What is also important is that the fastest growing segment of college students are those coming from low-income families and marginalized communities, that they have less experience with financial aid and indebtedness and the award processes that universities are offering. So the Loyola Business Leadership Hub is pleased to bring you a panel of three renowned scholars that they will explain to us what is financial literacy, how it should be measured, how it affects our college students, particularly those coming from marginalized communities, and what we can do essentially to improve them. So with that kind of background, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers, which are introduced in the order that they're making their presentations. Drew Anderson is an economist at Rand Corporation and a prolific researcher on the economics of public policies in education, healthcare, and household finances. He has studied the state of financial knowledge in colleges, focusing on the effects of college financial aid programs, answering the question how students build credentials for the workforce and how well college students understand the student loan system. In his presentation, Drew is discussing the work that he did while he was an economist at Rand Corporation. Welcome, Drew. Lauren Willis is Associate Dean for Research, Professor of Law, and William M. Raines Fellow at Loyola Law School at Loyola Marymount University. Lauren specializes in consumer law and policy, including consumer finance, privacy, contracts, education, disclosure, and litigation. Her scholarly work concentrates on the intersection of consumer psychology, market structure, and law. She's an avid critic of the role and efficacy of financial education on financial literacy, and you will see that I'm not kidding. Before coming to academia, Lauren was a litigator, in the housing section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission on predatory mortgage lending litigations. Our third speaker, Lukas Menkhoff, is actually coming from Berlin. Thank you, Lukas, for taking the time because we are all during the daytime and your evening has already started. He is head of the Department of International Economics at German Institute of Economic Research, or DIW, in Berlin. He's a professor of economics at Humboldt University in Berlin and member of the finance group at Humboldt University. He's a prolific researcher focusing on international finance and financial development, and specifically for our program today on the impact of financial education on financial literacy and financial behavior. His work has been widely published in top economic and finance and statistical journals. Panel, thank you for joining us. We are delighted to have you. So without any further introduction, I will look at Drew to start his presentation.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everybody, and thank you for joining today, and thanks to the Quinlan School for organizing this. I'm going to start by focusing more on what college students know and how it varies for different students. And then I'll look forward to discussing more later and hearing from other panelists kind of more on what we can do about it. So today I'll be talking about research that was conducted by the RAND Corporation and by RTI International. Both are nonprofit research firms with a mission to use data and analysis to help improve society. And in this case, college student financial decisions. So first, just a little bit of framing on why we study college student knowledge. This might be a no-brainer question for you since you showed up at this webinar, but let me just give you my perspective as an economist. A fundamental question in economic research has been the return on investing in yourself and investing in your education. When people gain knowledge and skills, what we call human capital, the whole economy and society can benefit from that investment. And so the government often supports that investment of individuals, but the way society is investing in higher education has shifted. So there has been a shift away from funding colleges to help them keep tuition down up front, and a shift toward letting tuition increase and trying to support students individually to pay those costs. So that shift means a few things. It means, for one thing, more complicated decisions for the individual. Students are having now to piece together sources of funding from grants, their own work income, and increasingly borrowing. So there's at the same time been some kind of discouraging research evidence showing that although this aid is available to students, particularly low-income students, a big burden in terms of applying and accessing that aid has been put on those students. And so the lowest income students who need money the most are also saddled with the biggest burden of application. And so that just the complexity alone can stop students from accessing the aid they need, and then that can stop them from graduating. And that potentially worsens inequality. There's been some newer research showing that, on the brighter side, potentially the kinds of things you learn in financial literacy and financial education classes in high school might help college students make these decisions more wisely. And that's evidenced by better repayment of student loans. But at the time we took this up, there had not been a national study to just basically ask, can this shift to the individual work? It can only really work if students have enough knowledge to navigate all this complexity. And so we took a first step towards that by looking at some new national evidence on what college students know, the state of financial knowledge in college. So to investigate that, we use this National Postsecondary Student Aid Study. This is the best source of information on students paying for college in terms of breadth. It started in 1987. It currently runs every 4 years. It pulls together a bunch of different data on surveys of individual students, administrative data from colleges, loan records from the government. So it's this picture of student finances, and it represents all undergraduates. So don't just be thinking about students who come from high school straight into college, but adult students, people getting short-term credentials at community colleges, any undergraduate. I'm going to be talking about the most recent data from 2016. The 2020 data collection is complete, but we're still waiting on those results any minute. They're not available yet. So we'll be looking back in time a little bit about students who have now probably left college. They're still in the repayment system. They're all on a student loan repayment pause at the moment. But the cool thing for our topic today was, for the first time, this major national study had a section about financial literacy. So we asked two main research questions. So first, who is financially literate? Students were asked the so-called big three financial literacy questions. And we don't have time to read through them now, but they're multiple choice questions. And they cover the topics of interest, inflation, and diversification. And so here are the results of these 90,000 some students answering these questions. You can see, for example, about 6 in 10 understood the concept of inflation and got that question correct. People did better for interest, and the people did worse for diversification. And just over a quarter of students were able to get all three of these questions right. So these are pretty widely used questions. You can look them up and see how you would do. We can also just compare students to some other groups who answered them, the same questions in some other survey samples. So our college students did about the same as young adults, not as well as the overall average adult. And they did about half as well as college graduates who had finished college and were, fielded this survey later in life. So in these other studies using the big three, a really common finding was just major differences in financial literacy across groups. And we're going to see that in college students too. So financial literacy was lower among some groups that traditionally face challenges in college. Lower family income, lower grades in college, minority status, and just students going to less selective and to for-profit colleges, they all scored lower on these three questions. So the second question we asked was, who is student loan literate? Since the rise in student debt is really motivating a lot of this conversation. And these questions were asked of everybody, not just students who had borrowed already. People who could borrow in the future as they continue in their college studies, or who had already, just the whole mix of all of those types of students. So the students were asked if they knew about consequences of not being able to pay student loans. So you might, if you can't pay your student loans, you have worse credit, you can have your wages garnished, you can lose part of your tax refund, but you have the potential to get into income-driven repayment plans from the government. So students, when they were looking at this, just needed to state that they knew about these concepts. And only 14.7% said they knew them all. So probably the most troubling is the least known thing was the fact that you can get into income-driven repayment, IDRs, the abbreviation I'm using here on the slide. So I personally would not have picked exactly these questions as the most important pieces of student loan knowledge. I'd be more interested, for example, if students knew just the kind of yes/no question, whether government loans are typically less expensive than private loans, which they are, and that should hopefully an easy one. Or, I would have liked to know whether students were aware of the size of payments they would need to make after college, which that's a tougher question, but super important. But this is what we had to work with. So it shows students kind of lack student loan literacy in general. And again, these same three, just the first three, not the IDR question, were posed to a national sample of adults. And in this case, college students did better than the general public. But in both surveys, a big theme jumped out, which was people who had student loans had higher student loan literacy. So in this graph, the darker bars represent borrowers. And you can see they had a higher percentage of getting these questions right across the board than college students who were non-borrowers. What we thought was the most interesting was that when looking at student loan literacy, those patterns of difference in financial literacy disappeared. It mattered a lot less whether you were economically disadvantaged or academically disadvantaged, or even if you had very, very low financial literacy yourself, the borrowers across the board knew more about student loans. So we need more research on how the borrowing process might have increased student loan literacy, whether it was just through the experience of taking out a loan or if there were specific education moments during the application process or during entrance counseling. We weren't able to dig that up in this research. But I will stop there and just leave you with some takeaways from this particular research as background as this conversation continues. So college students know less than the average American about finances. To best use loans, borrowers should know their options. And we found that teaching borrowers general financial literacy is not enough to get them informed about student loans. Those are different things. Some good news was that borrowers did gain student loan literacy, but we're not sure exactly how. So if you want to know more, here are some links to these related articles, and we'll share these slides out if you want to dig into these. Yeah, happy to provide more details as we continue to discuss, and I'll hand it off.
Great, thanks. So thanks, Abul and Ashlyn, for arranging this whole meeting. Thanks also to my co-panelists, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Menkoff. So when I was sent the title of the panel, Financial Literacy and Financial Wellbeing, I thought that my role here might be questioning a bit of that link. And so Abul sent us some questions, and I wanted to answer those questions. Being, a professor, I try to be a good student. So the first questions were, are college students financially literate? And what's the level for underrepresented communities due to race or socioeconomic status? And, I think it really depends how we define financial literacy. And you could see that in Dr. Anderson's slides, right? If you define financial literacy as knowing about the things that matter in your life, well, then, perhaps we're not doing as terribly as we otherwise think we are. If student loan borrowers know about student loans, it really doesn't matter as much that non-borrowers don't know. Now, the big three questions that are typically asked, as Dr. Anderson pointed out, are just three questions. One of them is more relevant to those who have investments, and so are more relevant to wealthier people, right? What we don't ask in the big three is about budgeting behavior, price shopping, thrift, and in those areas, the poor probably know quite a bit more and know how to engage in behaviors that are more optimal for them. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that any group is able to function particularly well in the current marketplace. But I do think it is important for us not to think, well, if you don't know about compounding, well, then you're financially illiterate. The standard question, if you have $100 and you make a 10% annual rate of return compounded over 2 years, at the end of 2 years, will you have $120, more than $120, or less than $120? And the only person who answers that question correctly, I think, is Matt Levine at Bloomberg, who says, well, what you really have is zero, because anyone who's offering you 10% is a scammer, and they're going to take all your money. And that might be something that poor people are more likely to know. But they would get, of course, the question wrong on the test. The impact of financial literacy on financial well-being and inclusion was the next question in the list we were asked to answer. Again, obviously depends on the measures used for financial literacy. But regardless, there's a lack of clarity on the direction of causality, right? Do student borrowers know more about student loans because they're more student borrower financially literate about student loans? Probably the causation goes in the opposite direction, right? They are themselves borrowing or are in communities that are borrowing more, and so therefore know more. This word inclusion, too, I think is not always a very helpful word to use. Certainly, it can be the wiser financial choice to avoid mainstream institutions. Overdraft loans are more expensive than payday loans. And Pewdish put out a report yesterday about some FDIC insured banks that are now putting out small dollar loans that are more expensive than payday loans. There's an interesting example of this. A friend of mine who's a bit older, his daughter, when she was in grade school, walked with her class down to the local bank. The kids all put, $5 into bank accounts that they all opened. So to, teach them about financial inclusion, they should all be included and have bank accounts. Well, then along comes a bigger bank, swallows up the little bank, and charges fees for low balance accounts. Suddenly all the children owed the bank money. So that exercise, I think, taught those kids quite a bit about the financial world, perhaps not the lesson of inclusion as being necessarily such a good thing. And of course, if what we're talking about is, can financial literacy help with inclusion writ large, obviously it cannot surmount sort of these big discriminatory forces that are out there and that are well documented in the financial realm. As Abul mentioned in the intro, I used to work on lending discrimination cases against banks. Now, the next question is, do financial education programs by themselves create financial well-being and social mobility? I think, the obvious answer is no, they don't. Certainly there's no good evidence that they do. There are many studies on this. The quality of most of those studies is quite poor, partly because it's very hard to study. So a lot of the studies lack controls, they have confounds, they, in addition to giving some financial literacy training, they also give people matching funds, or they establish peer pressure groups to get people to say that kind of thing. Very unreliable measures are used in a lot of these. Much of it is self-reporting. Sometimes it's just attitudes, like the question is it good to save? And one would hope that you could answer that question correctly directly after taking a class that just told you it's good to save. Of course, it might not be true for your family. Savings might not be the right path to take. It might be better to invest in human capital. But in any case, these are not terribly reliable measures of literacy. A lot of studies find null or paradoxical effects. What is fairly well documented are overconfidence effects. And of course, this can be quite dangerous. On the one hand, we want people to have confidence in general, but overconfidence in finance can be problematic. And even those who increase their knowledge of financial matters in these classes think they've increased it quite a bit more than they actually have. If you then ask them applied questions, they tend not to be able to answer correctly. And we have here on the panel Dr. Menkoff, who has done the best meta-analysis in this area, looked at 76 different individual studies around the world. I mean, it's an incredibly thorough, tremendous amount of work, careful work went into that. But the problem, even with a great meta-analysis, is it can't overcome the weakness in the underlying studies. And every outcome measure for budgeting in that study is self-reported. Not a single one that anyone actually goes into someone's home or looks at what they're actually doing. And most of the savings one are as well in that study. And a meta-analysis itself just isn't that useful in this area, given that the treatments that are given are so diverse and the outcome measures that are used in the underlying studies are so diverse. So just to take 3 of the studies within that particular meta-analysis, but prior meta-analyses of financial education have the same issue. One is a study of an educational soap opera that was found to have a positive effect on calls to a debt counseling hotline when the debt counseling hotline number was shown at the end of the soap opera. And that was considered to be a positive effect of this soap opera, which was considered to be financial literacy education. Another was an online program that found null effect on self-reported likelihood of opening a retirement account. And another was this sort of lengthy high school course that found negative effects in that students reported, self-reported, an increase in late payments and more use of high-cost credit. So bunching these studies together can't really tell you anything about financial literacy education, right? It really doesn't help terribly much. It's like taking an analysis of, the efficacy of bloodletting and the efficacy of, COVID treatments and the efficacy of heart surgery, and putting them together and saying, well, medical interventions are not helpful or are helpful. It really just can't tell you terribly much. And really, we shouldn't expect these programs by themselves to create financial well-being or social mobility. The gulf is so wide. We do not teach basic math skills. Americans cannot calculate a 20% tip on their meal. And the market just changes too quickly. Regulators have difficulty keeping up. Certainly financial educators have trouble keeping up. The information that they teach is often outdated on arrival. And it's a good thing that our market is dynamic, of course, but it does make it impossible nearly to actually educate people with these financial courses. In addition, the industry marketing and sales practices are going to be there at the moment of decision. The class you took back in high school isn't so present at that point. And of course, we know in terms of social mobility that the causes of really trenchant inequality in the US are structural. They're not about literacy. So I am sort of an optimist in the sense that I think, hey, we could put a person on the moon, we could do anything. So how could we do it? If we did, we would have to be teaching people every year of their lives. We would have to have this incredibly intensive, extensive program. It would be massively inefficient. I mean, I don't have to go out and study how toasters work and then assess whether the one I'm going to buy is going to blow up. That would be a wildly inefficient use of each consumer's resources. And we shouldn't each have to figure out whether our mortgage is going to blow up either. It's not a financially literate decision to create financial well-being and social mobility in this manner. And then the last question was, how do we develop creative financial programs to enhance social mobility? Now, if we're just talking about financial programs, a robust inheritance tax or wealth tax, of course, would be useful to enhance social mobility. But I don't think that's what really this question was trying to get at. I think really we're trying to get at what other interventions are available to us to enhance people's well-being, financial well-being. Well, one thing we could do is work on improving people's decision-making capacities generally. And the single most cost-effective way to do that is to reduce alcohol and pollution exposure in utero and increase nutrition in utero and at very early ages. These things will improve children's cognition. That's their brains will just work better lifelong. And we know that basic cognitive ability in math is very important for financial decisions in the long run. It also increases executive function capabilities. And things like being able to plan for the future, being able to be patient, things of this nature. And that would have just an incredible bang for the buck if we were to spend resources there. We can increase adult health too, and improvements in adult health and mindfulness training also help for executive functioning, but the return on investment is much lower once people are older. We could provide people with better decision supports. Wealthy people hire financial advisors. We could have supports for people. We would probably call them counselors if they're poor people that are accessing them, but the same idea. We could also have, other kinds of tools. So in some of the financial education studies, some of the confounds are things like reminders, text reminders on making payments and things like this. And those were sometimes successful. So we could increase the use of those kinds of things. We could enable people to engage in financial planning. When your income and your expenses are unpredictable and highly variable, which happens when you work in service sectors where you don't know your own schedule week to week, how many hours you're going to be given, what you're going to be able to earn, or when you don't know what your medical expenses are going to be because you don't have sufficient insurance. You can't plan. Even, your top level economist cannot plan for someone who has unpredictable expenses and income unless the person has substantial slack in their budget. And so ways we could enable financial planning is we could pay people a living wage. We could require there to be structures set up in place to provide more insurance for various situations. Also, and this came up also in Dr. Anderson's talk, we could, instead of demanding that people go through incredibly complex processes to figure out how to finance college, we could have simpler processes. So we could have sort of your basic transaction accounts available at low or no cost, those kinds of just basic tools that people need. We also have the problem that we don't enforce current law that would regulate the marketplace terribly well. I mean, if we were navigating a marketplace in which there was substantially less deception, less discrimination, and less anti-competitive conduct, it would be a heck of a lot easier for consumers to navigate that. And yet our enforcement of the current laws, and despite the fact that I was a former enforcer, I have to say we really are lacking here, both on sort of intensive and extensive margins. When you look at how long did it take for Wells Fargo to be discovered by the government that they had opened 1.5 million accounts, fake accounts for people? 5,000 employees had engaged in this behavior before the government did anything about it. Or PayPal. The CFPB went after PayPal. The allegations are that PayPal actually, when people were clicking on their transaction account on the screen, PayPal physically moved the button for credit, PayPal credit, to where the button was for the transaction account, so that people mistakenly hit the credit button instead and ended up having to pay fees. PayPal ended up having to pay 0.002% of its income that year as a penalty. That's nothing. We just are not making it, we're making it quite cost effective, quite financially literate for firms to violate these laws. And we can move to a different kind of regulatory model, and which I'm happy to speak about later. I've been working with the Australian government and the government in the UK to work towards performance and outcomes-based regulation, making financial product sellers, service and product sellers design their products to foreseeably assist in consumer outcomes and to market and sell them in such a way that they will reach those consumers for whom they are likely to create positive outcomes. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Abul. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here and to present a paper that does not really fit 100% to the topic of this panel, but you invited me to present this paper from a few years ago, which is a meta-study and informs about the impact of financial education on financial knowledge and financial behavior. So I'm glad to present it, and I try to provide at least the main insights from this paper, but I cannot go into details or techniques what we have done. It's joint work with Tim Kaiser, and I provide here where it has been published. If you don't have access, you can also find working paper versions in the internet. So I can skip my first slide because we had already a lot of information about the motivation, where the problems are, why financial education might be helpful or what it should address. So I would like to start with this map here, because this map gives us some information about the international cross-section of financial knowledge or financial literacy. It's a simple measure, of course, but still it gives us some information how it is distributed, and we can see we get the same basically insight that we get within countries, so that higher income, higher education, and so on are positively related to a higher level of financial literacy in this case. So dark blue means higher level of financial literacy, and these are the numbers here of this measure that's taken, and then the light blue here in the southern world, you can see it as lower levels. Okay, so this is interesting because I also do research in a lot of developing countries, and so I have also some motivation to do that there. So at least from my background, I would judge that policymakers in many countries invest a lot of resources in financial education, and what they aim to do is they want to improve the level of financial literacy, which is more kind of a cognitive channel, but they also try other ways to improve financial behavior, which is not always just by improving knowledge, but which can be other techniques or other insights that people get, and the OECD is very active in that area. So this is just some motivation, and this brings me now to the meta study I want to present to you. And the meta study needs a lot of decisions to be made, but the advantage of a meta study is that you can discuss all of these steps. The data are available, so it's up to everybody to bring in own ideas or criteria and to change maybe in the end also outcomes if somebody is interested to do that. So the first thing is the inclusion criteria, which kind of work is considered and which kind of work is not considered. When we started this meta study, we did, of course, some literature search, and we found about very roughly 1,000 studies that reported some financial education intervention and which you could potentially consider for your work. However, we have some minimum requirements, and due to these requirements, this universe boils down considerably. So we work with a little more than 100 studies in this case, and I show you one of the implications soon. I cannot go into details, sorry. If you're interested, I mean, the paper is available. So the second issue is that there's a lot of different ways of financial behavior that are of interest and which are not easy to compare. So typical example is people should, at least the objective of many of these trainings is that people save more, and then you can measure this either that they start saving at all, or you can measure the amount of savings, the savings is at specific institutions, things like this. So this means you have to standardize trying to make them comparable. and there are various ways to do so. So we have decided for one way, which is standard in the meta-study literature. Then you can use different units of observation. You can take a total study. You can take different outcomes within studies. So in the meta-analysis that I present here, we are at the outcome level. So we measure maybe in some cases lots of effects within one study. So an example could be then for that whether people open a savings account. Another outcome could be how much more they save than before, or anyways, things like this. Then if you run meta regressions, you are interested in considering exogenous variables. We'll show you the list later on, or at least a selection of this list. And finally, it's like a regression. So you can imagine a meta-study is like regression, and the unit of observation of meta-studies are basically studies or effects in studies. So it's similar to regressions that you use when you have individual observations or that you have country observations. You do a cross-country regression. Here we do a kind of cross-study regression. Okay, so that is just to give you some flavor how this kind of meta-regression works. And let me just point out a little bit about the first one here, because the first one makes a lot of a difference what kind of studies you're including. And I've borrowed this chart here from another meta-study, Fernandez and others, and they had included in their study a variety of different kinds of studies that are considered. And what you see here is the size shows you the degree of effectiveness. So a higher size means here that these studies are more effective than these studies, and that studies. And the difference between these groups of studies is the measurement of effects. And without going into detail, let me put it that way, these are the most simple ways to measure it. And this one is the most rigorous way to measure it. So it makes a difference whether you look at these kind of studies or whether you look at that kind of studies. In our meta-study, we consider these kind of studies and a subset of these studies. All of them that we consider are experimental studies. This would, I guess, as a minimum condition and that you should take, because here you have distortions. These are overestimations of effectiveness. Anyway, so we are here in that area. And here you see just the number of studies that are included in our meta-study. And you see there's always a certain amount of quasi-experiment, whereas the so-called RCTs, the randomized control trials, they are a quite recent subset of the starting basically in the 2010s here. So this is the universe of studies we are covering. What is interesting is that some studies cover the effect on financial behavior, others cover the effect on financial literacy, and these are the effect sizes. Basically, these are, so to speak, the number of observations that are interesting for us. This is one of the main outcomes, because here you see now this is our measure of effectiveness, the so-called Hedges G. So the Hedges G is a unit, it is a standardized unit which cannot be directly interpreted. It's a statistical unit. Basically, you can think about standard deviation units. And positive G's mean that you have the desired or the intended effect, and negative means you have unintended effects. And this is the average effect across all studies regarding behavior. This is the average effect across all studies regarding literacy. And to put this in perspective, we have quite good documentation of effectiveness of education in various fields. And the degree of success that we get here by this measure is nicely comparable to other fields of education. And you can say this is here on knowledge, this is roughly the same that you get in other areas. And this is, for example, in schools when you teach other subjects. What is more difficult, and I think this is obvious, is to trying if you want to change behavior. So the effect is in this study here about 1/3. It's much lower, but still it's highly significant. So the p-value here is clear, indicates clearly it's a positive effect. that you have large degree of heterogeneity is interesting and motivates our research, our own research agenda, because we're interested trying to learn what makes some studies or what makes some interventions so successful and which makes some other interventions unsuccessful. Okay, here now we get the same information, but we get it split up into the kind of studies. Here are these studies, these are the effects on literacy, the effects on behavior. These studies are the most rigorous ones. These are not quite as rigorous, and you see also in our universe it makes a difference. But even if you take the most rigorous ones, you still have positive effects on literacy and behavior. Okay, let me summarize the effects. So what we find is that financial education is generally effective, has a strong impact on financial literacy comparable to other subjects, has a positive and significant impact on financial behavior, which is although much lower than on knowledge. The effect holds for subsamples of so-called RCTs. This is the most rigorous measurement. The effect holds for all kinds of regression models. So in this case, I've presented OLS results, but you can take other methods. It doesn't really matter. It holds when we control for publication bias. So the control for publication bias is a bit simple in this paper. It's more elaborated in a different paper. It goes down. So considering publication bias does reduce the size of the effect, but it's still significantly positive. And the effect is mostly positive for most outcomes, but I come back to that later. And because Abol was interested in this inclusion issue, so we do not measure inclusion here, but we have a different paper in World Development where we analyze the effect of financial literacy on financial inclusion. It's a cross-country study. So it's mainly driven by results from developing countries. So overall, it's robustly effective, but heterogeneous effects. And let me have a look now at these problematic issues, which may be problematic and maybe play a role when you talk about student loans and things like this. So here we split up the results according to outcome areas. And you see the effect on financial knowledge is particularly large. So this would be a zero effect. And the line here indicates confidence intervals. So here we can quite safely say we have positive effects. The same is also true for budgeting and planning behavior, which was also mentioned by Lauren Willis in her presentation. We also see quite good positive effect on savings and retirement savings, but the problematic issue is borrowing, and this was also addressed already before, because borrowing, it depends a little bit on the exact study and so on, but you can say the effect on borrowing is definitely much lower, and it's not so clear that it is really positive. The other issues here, I mean, we have a very small set of observations, so I don't like to discuss them. Okay, second issue is the target groups. I mean, it was already mentioned before. We have lower levels of financial literacy, in particular in those groups which are problematic anyway, which have lower level of education and income. And we also find this now regarding the effectiveness of education. So it's not just that they have a lower level, it's also that the effectiveness of teaching is smaller. Which is a problem by itself. And this, I mean, I cannot go through all of the coefficients here, but this is a kind of, it's a regression. We explain the degree of effectiveness, and these are potentially explaining variables. And so as time is running, I can't go through all of these variables, but you can see here for low income clients, it's a negative sign. That means the effect of when you teach low-income clients is smaller than when you teach clients with higher incomes, and you find a similar effect, at least in this study here, on countries. So it's more difficult in developing countries than in others. Okay, so I'm coming to the end, but I would like to show you a little bit what we do, what could be done to improve or to influence the effectiveness of financial education. I give you an example of an RCT that we have done in Uganda. So Uganda is one of those countries with an extremely low level of financial knowledge. And the central bank and the government is quite committed to trying to improve this. And so we are part of a larger effort in that country, and a very small part. So what we have done, and what's interesting, we have developed or modified, it's not basically our work, what we have done is we are the academics who try to measure the effect. So there's a local university where there's some cooperation with the German Development Organization, and we were analyzing the effectiveness of a program they have run in Uganda, in that area. And the difference between the standard program, how it is usually taught by the central bank and its teachers, and this program, is that it's based on principles of active learning, even though they did not develop it knowing these principles, but it's basically what they do. And it's adapted to the community there. I would not claim that this works everywhere in the world, even though the active learning approach seems to be very successful almost everywhere. But the specifics of this program may be also specific to this target group here, to these people from Western Uganda. And some elements I think everybody understands directly is this is a program where people speak more relative to conventional lecturing. There's much higher active involvement. They discuss more issues among each other, which is also different from most teaching exercises. So there are a lot of activities and games involved, and there's some prepared material which is adapted to the specific target groups. And maybe, so because this is of course a kind of disadvantaged target group in a poor country, maybe this is an approach which can, at least in principle, not the specific curriculum, but this approach in principle can be transferred to other areas, also those that Abol is interested in and mentioned. Okay, overall, there are a lot of points where financial education can be or can potentially be improved. So it's a kind of complementary to what Lauren Willis told us, because she emphasized those things beyond financial education, but within the universe of financial education, there are things you can do. And then I do not want to go through all this full list here, but it gives you some ideas that a lot of experiments are ongoing. The question is always, can these study results be generalized? So I'm a bit cautious about that. So what we learned, let's say in Uganda, may be irrelevant to a community. I've also worked in Thailand, and it's culturally very different from Uganda. So you cannot just transfer it to another country. It's also not so clear for which groups this always holds. I mean, we have a specific group, and the same experience you may have in advanced countries applies probably also in these countries. So my conclusion is here that much more research is necessary to have a robust evidence what could be best practices for specific countries, target groups, and so on. So you cannot roll out a specific curriculum to everybody. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Lucas. I think we talked about this. Can you tell us a little bit about financial literacy in Germany?
Germany. So in Germany is one of the few European countries where there is no national strategy of financial education. So there's hardly any other country left, and the reason is probably that it is not easy, because we are a federal state, and education is an issue of the state. At the state level, we have 16 states, and they cannot really coordinate on what they want to do about financial education. So we have some states where it's taught at school, and other states there's, some elements are always there, but in a very different form. So this is, and it's not coordinated across states. It's not coordinated at different steps and with different institutions. So one of the problems from my perspective is that there are too many institutions involved in financial education issues in schools. So you have a lot of interest groups who come in there, and a lot of these teaching materials are not very good, at least according to what our consumer protection agencies say. So there's really need to improve on that. So that's a bit of a pity. Other countries are much more advanced in this respect. So I'm sorry that I cannot report more about that. So Germany is not a good example, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, panel. Thank you for all the interesting observations that you have shared with us. And also you were completely on time, exactly 15 minutes each presenter. Thank you. We have had a bunch of very interesting questions. So as I have been jotting them down, I try to find some common threads in these questions so that I can combine them and ask some questions. One question, one observation that has emerged is that if financial literacy is a problem, whose fault it is? And there is one comment that it says that, is it the fault of the government because they provide basically government guarantees for some of the loans that the students are receiving, and that sort of create, just the behavioral problems. Another question says that when universities offer loans to students, they don't want to talk about all the bad things that is going to happen if the loan is not paid, because obviously that is going to dissuade the student in terms of, just getting admitted in that. So should the universities actually be more, conscious and effective in terms of communicating the consequences? So let's focus on the role of the government and universities in terms of not providing education necessarily, but just at the inception of getting the students into the loans.
I have a couple thoughts on that. Do colleges have incentives to keep students informed of the risks? Yes, colleges can lose access to federal student loans for their students if enough of their students don't repay, if they leave college and end up in default. But that is a very high bar to hit and lose access. You have to have a large rate of non-repayment. So is that enough of an incentive to get colleges to really focus on repayment? Probably not. I would say that what everyone wants is, including colleges and students, and the government, is for people to borrow whatever the right amount is to be successful and then repay. For some people who are worried and not start out being kind of scared about the risk, more information might make them feel less risk and feel okay investing in a loan that they can probably pay back. And that would be good. There are other people who probably don't think about the risks and might need more information. A little bit like what Lauren was saying about savings. Telling everyone to save is not the right answer for all families. So yeah, so those incentives should be in place for people to borrow the right amount. It's just like how to communicate it to people. And so then secondly, about is just the fact that that anyone who goes to college can get government loans, is somehow contributing to people not needing to know more what I said was basically that there's already too many hurdles between students and some of the financing they need. Whereas some people believe maybe there's not enough. They need to enforce more education or something like that. That's also a really tricky issue, but I tend to think that the point of student loans is to give pretty easy to get credit to students that then a lot of ends up being forgiven on the back end if students cannot pay or for whatever reason. And just I'll wrap up with one more, just the institutional piece. It is federally required for colleges to educate their students on student loans before they take them, using a federally provided slate of facts that they have to convey. But it's also required that colleges not make it any harder than that to get loans. If colleges are going to offer the loans, they're not allowed to put a bunch of educational barriers between students and those loans. So I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I'd love to hear what other folks think.
Who wants to address that issue again? Lauren?
Yeah, I think perhaps, in Europe, having more government support for education means it's not quite the issue there. I actually have a friend who sent her children to Germany for college so that they would not have any student debt. So a big problem is that this threshold is terribly high, right, in terms of what the repayment rate has to be. Certainly, there have been these issues. It shouldn't just be a repayment rate. It should also be looking into things like, are students actually graduating? Are students able to get jobs? And a lot of these for-profit institutions turn out to just be scams, right? A lot of them have folded and left people with lots of debt. It's an area where the government should not be handing out a bunch of money to an institution that is essentially a fraud. And we have done not a terribly good job with that. We are getting better at it, but we for many years did not do a good job at that. And so I certainly agree.
Lucas?
I'm not sure that I can add something from my perspective.
Okay.
I'm not so familiar with the problems in the US. When we talk about over-indebtedness problems, we typically mean consumer over-indebtedness, but it's not really so much a problem of students. No.
Great. Another question is that we have among our audience several banks that they have participated. I was quite interested in saying that. And banks do have programs that they offer to their clients in terms of providing them with basic financial literacy issues when they negotiate a mortgage, open an account, and a variety of other services that they're providing. What do you think the banks and financial institutions in general, and brokerage firms particularly, and I want to relate that to the advent of Robinhood, that you know that a lot of young students are investing via Robinhood. And given the statistics that it has been revealed here, particularly in terms of diversification, I think that seems to be quite interesting. So what is the responsibility of the private sector, and particularly the financial institutions and brokerage firms, investment bankers, in terms of this area of financial literacy? That's a question that has also been proposed.
Well, I'd be happy to address that.
Go ahead.
These financial education programs are very popular among financial services providers, even debt collectors who only make money if consumers can't pay their debts. They support financial education. And they support it individuals within firms who are working on these issues are very well motivated and are trying to help individual people. I have no doubt about that. But institutionally, it's a win for the debt collectors because of opportunity costs. Policymakers focus on financial literacy efforts that don't really work, and they don't regulate the debt collectors. That's very convenient for them. It also creates sort of the whole education enterprise, the way in which we structure it, creates a culture of consumer responsibility, right? Consumers are supposed to be responsible for their financial choices. We blame them when things go wrong, even when it's COVID that hit, right? Even for people who don't have any slack in their budgets, can't possibly weather COVID. But we don't put a similar sense of responsibility on financial firms. So in the United States, financial firms are not required to act responsibly, right? They're not required to communicate with consumers in a way that consumers understand in a timely, usable way. They have no duty to avoid foreseeable consumer harm. They can sell consumers a product that they could foresee would actually cause harm. Robinhood can, market itself to people knowing that they don't have the resources to make that the risk that they're going to take on be appropriate. And they don't have even just a basic good faith obligation, right? They can use spurious, gratuitous complexity in products to confuse consumers. And so the problem is that we just don't have a responsible financial culture on the provider side because we don't make them, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying any one individual is a bad person or anything of this matter or irresponsible. I mean, every person who works for a financial institution they're trying to feed their families, right? But the teller is trying to feed their own families. And so it's a structural problem that we have set up the structure whereby banks are supposed to serve their shareholders and not their consumers, their customers.
Anybody else who wants to take a shot at that?
So what I can add from a German perspective, that I observe that financial institutions are quite active in supporting. In Germany, it's mainly called economic education, not so much financial education. So they're very committed to that area, but as I said before, it's at a different level of quality. So that's why what I personally don't like that too much. I mean, I appreciate this commitment or this efforts, but I think a better way to do this would to have a kind of education which is really where we have some evidence that it really works and it's fair. But still, I mean, the financial sector has not that much interest in at least over-indebted customers. But what we observe in Europe is that during the course of liberalization of financial markets and also the credit loan markets, we have higher interest rates and more consumer defaults. And I mean, it's profitable for the financial sector. It's our decision how we structure these markets.
I'm not an expert on the regulatory piece, but just the mention of Robinhood got me thinking about behavioral economics. And just to put on that like psychology hat for a second, we have a lot of natural biases to focus very short term and on ourselves. And it's a dangerous thing because you may doing retail investing may feel good and like a win, but the opportunity cost of doing that instead of putting your money in a mutual fund and letting the institutional investors manage it, in the long run, it might actually be a loss. And while repaying your student loans after college might feel like a loss because it's a pain, in the long run, it might have been a win to have invested in that education that it let you buy. So it's really easy for individuals to get stuck on narrow concerns of the moment. And so hopefully us researchers can shed some light on how to manage your money, which I think like retail investing is not your first choice, and how to invest in your future. And I do think college is still a majorly positive investment for most people who can finish degrees and who go to just their local public community colleges, which is the vast majority of people. And student loan debt is an okay way to finance that. The problem is that the safeguards that are in place for students to get into income-driven repayment are not well known, and even if they are well known, they're a big pain to get through. So I'll stop there.
We have a very interesting question from a volunteer worker who helps in families in South Side of Chicago. And the question is that the work is with families that one parent is working and one of the children has a job, and they're obviously experiencing difficulties. What can we do in a practical sense to help families in that area to really learn a little bit about financial literacy in such a way that it will be helpful to them? They don't have necessarily access to some of the things that we have discussed. Can we just bring that one level lower and try to see that what is the practical way to reach out?
Thinking about preparing for college, the big number one thing to do is to file the FAFSA. And it kind of feels like filing taxes. You need to first know the information you would need to file taxes and then do it. And it's the kind of thing that anybody can help just by being a buddy, just by help. There are big events at high schools where teachers and community members just like sit with people and they're like, yes, this is going to be annoying. You're gonna have to get through a bunch of forms, but it's possible to do. And so when you do that, the things you get out of it are the information of what kind of grants you might be eligible for, what kind of loans you might be eligible for. So it's possible for people to help even without being an expert, because the main barrier, I think, is just the like over the complexity, kind of overwhelming ness. It kind of feels to me like paying taxes. And so if communities can help, but then also tax preparers can help, which can be, that's offered free at in communities in various different ways.
Also, as you mentioned, many people don't know about income-driven repayment plans, and FAFSA doesn't tell you about that either. And so that's something that's good for people to know about going in, and I think can sort of relieve some fears and pressures as well. And in addition, I think that there are ways to be supportive of people that are not necessarily about transmitting information. So the getting together to fill out the forms together as a supportive exercise, these are the kinds of things that people need, and they're not about knowledge. They're really about different forms of support. I find a lot of these community organizations, they may think that the reason things are what they're providing is information, but what they're really providing is respect and peer support, which are terribly important.
So my view on this issue is that I do not exactly know, of course, what you are talking about. I don't know southern Chicago or that area, but I can imagine that problems, it's probably a less privileged area, but I can imagine that the situation, for example, that you quickly told you about, Uganda, for example, these people are probably not in a better situation, put it that way. And you can reach them with financial education. I mean, they're very, they're very glad to get this education. I mean, they're happy to get any kind of useful education, but if it's targeted to their needs and it's provided in a language that they understand, and this is what this adapted curriculum tries to do, then I think it can be very helpful for them and can help them in their daily life. And one of the problems in that area, for example, because it is with small entrepreneurs, is then indeed that they improve their savings behavior so that they accumulate funds, can invest more and become more productive.
We have another question that I tried to read it. The OECD defines financial literacy as a combination of awareness, knowledge, skill, attitude, and behavior necessary to make sound financial decisions. I think OECD has done that for a long time. Shouldn't we start going beyond measuring financial literacy as pure financial knowledge, and especially consider the awareness, skills, and attitude apart? Of course, that definitely goes to Lauren.
Well, I certainly think we want to be measuring behavior. Attitude is a little trickier, right? If you teach someone a program and then you ask them, do you think savings is a good idea? I don't think it's a terribly useful measure. Or even do you think banks are good, right? That's not useful. What you need is things like support, finding out about people's behaviors. And some of those behaviors are more about harm avoidance, right? Avoiding scams, and also long-term thinking, right? So that you're planning, you're realizing maybe doing, working 2 jobs while you're in high school and then not being able to get into college because you failed your classes is not a good long-term decision. Or I know some of these financial literacy classes in some more impoverished countries have actually led to families sending their kids to go work more instead of continuing their education. And so making sure that we're looking at things in a very, big picture, holistic way for health, and not just measuring sort of individual kind of literacy, typical literacy kind of outcomes.
Another question is, we don't necessarily have a course called financial literacy in the core curriculum of the university. At least we don't have it at Loyola. So do you think that the core curriculum of undergraduate programs should have a course on financial literacy, which captures the overall discussion and issues that we have discussed?
I can talk about, I mean, it's a question of opportunity cost. Again, I guess if you're spending time doing that, you might not be spending time doing something else, but I don't know also of like, I know there is some research that is limited to individual colleges that looked at use of financial literacy classes, but I'm more familiar with research of high school mandates because states have implemented mandated financial education at different times and for different reasons. And so researchers have used the 50 states of the United States as sort of a little laboratory to see for cohorts of high school students who were exposed to these mandates versus others who were similar and maybe same years or neighboring states, just to see what happened afterwards. And some of the most interesting research on that, I can share the link or something, but Daniel Mangrum is the name of a researcher at the New York Federal Reserve, and did an analysis of those mandates and how they affected borrowing for college and then repayment. And the news was good, where people had spent time learning about finances and then also learning about different careers and different earnings you can get in different careers. Those people were, when they were from lower income family backgrounds, were no less likely to borrow. So knowing more information didn't make them borrow less for college, but it did make the ones who graduated college more likely to repay their debt faster. So that was good news. And then it also had a small effect on some more higher income folks. Actually, they borrowed a little bit less. So it might have been the case that they learned something about rearranging their methods of paying for college towards working or grants or something like that. So all in all, positive support for high school financial education mandates.
We have a listener that has shared a website that allows parents to find out the discounts that colleges are offering in the United States, and that could be really helpful. So we will make that available to everybody. There's also an issue that whether financial literacy has to be taught at high schools versus universities. Which one is a better environment to receive that information?
So from when I start from my German European perspective, it's definitely high school and not the university. So I think some of the basics have to be taught early, and it can be efficiently done. And from our perspective, I would say that the university is not a good place for financial education, but it's a very German view, possibly. I don't know how the situation is in the US. And my personal preference would be then rather problem-oriented kind of offers. I don't know how it looks like, but for example, with the entrance into the labor market, then you need information about retirement preparation, what you can do, what the alternatives are, and things like this. Because one of the strong findings that we get in this meta study is what we call the teachable moment. So it's good to address problems at the time when they are pressing for the people and not too general. So I think when you enter university, at least we don't have this kind of student loan system or something like that. So I don't think it's the right time.
We have a question definitely from several parents that they're asking that if they have children in the age of between 6 to 10, which presumably that's their situation. So they want to know what are some of the steps, easiest steps that they can take in terms of helping their children to have a better understanding, at least be better prepared as they grow up.
So I think math, which our public schools don't always do a great job of teaching, and developing a love and enjoyment of math problems, that it's fun, it's puzzles. And also decision-making skills along the nature of stopping and reflecting. Give yourself 24 hours to make big decisions, consult with your parents, consult with other people. Those kinds of skills, I think, are things to be thought about even before you might learn about very specific things. And once the kids are sort of old enough, there's also teaching about sort of incentives in the marketplace, understanding, how the person across the table from you is making money. Well, they're making money on a commission on you. So if they charge you more, they make more. They're not actually your friend. And sort of understanding those kinds of dynamics that, just basic economic incentive dynamics. And there are some interesting high school programs, like there's this foolproof program, which, I've spoken to, where they teach kids from sort of a consumer self-defense perspective. I think that could be an interesting new perspective. It's financial education, but it's totally different than what people sometimes think of.
I agree on that, and would like to add maybe what we know from empirical research is that that we see some kind of positive effects of those young ones who get pocket money, and that parents somehow reflect the behavior. And the other example is, of course, the example of parents. Because children observe their parents, so how do themselves behave and how do they reflect on financial issues?
Drew, last comment.
I don't have any thoughts on that one. I was someone mentioned private and public student loans, and I was just wanted to point out that private student loans are only like maybe 10% of the outstanding student loan debt. So public, I think what question was like, why should the public provide student loans? Why should private banks be interested in private funding student loans as well? And like what limits? Why are there limits on student loans and so forth? And obviously it's like good that you're lending first, that you can't repossess what people buy through it, the education, like just like you could repossess their car or house that you lent to them for. So it is natural for the government to make those kinds of loans because education is a public good that the private market might not support people for. But there does exist a private market that people go to above and beyond the government, and that can tend to be more focused on creditworthiness, whereas the government is supposed to just be blanket available for anyone at about the same amounts. The amounts currently are tied to just your year in college and almost nothing else, and your age too. Not things like what you major in or your family wealth or ability to repay. So the government really is providing that like basically non-market based first layer of credit, and then there's a little bit more for private. So I just wanted to like throw that out there in case people were wondering.
Well, panel, thank you very much. We are right at the dot of 90 minutes. I wanted, on behalf of the Loyola Business Leadership Hub and Quinlan School of Business and the university, thank you for attending. Thank you for giving your time and for your observations and summarizing what you have learned behaviorally as well as through research. And I want to thank you, our audience, for being with us, spending 90 minutes with us, asking very serious, interesting questions. I hope you enjoyed the program. We have the slides and we can share it with you. And also the whole program is recorded. And at this point, I will say good afternoon, and I hope you have a pretty good day. Thank you. Thank you for attending.